Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the QEM Heroes webinar series. Forgive my voice, it's a little raspy today. I'm Christine Wood, and I serve as the Assistant Program Director for the Heroes Fellows Program at QEM. For more than 30 years, QEM has been a national catalyst for STEM education transformation and research capacity building. Currently, the QEM network serves nearly 900 colleges and universities and reaches more than 8,000 individuals nationwide. This webinar is part of the HEROES initiative. The HEROES program brings together researchers with experience in the federal government to lend their expertise and support to the STEM research and education communities. Our fellows are here to provide tools and tips for navigating the funding landscape, developing STEM programs and partnerships, and improving talent retention in in-demand fields. We hope this series promotes engagement with our HEROES fellows and provides valuable resources to our participants. During the webinar, we invite you to use the Q&A tool to ask questions of our panelists. The webinar recordings and slides will be made available in the QEM Resource Hub. By attending this webinar, you will be added to the QEM network and granted access to the Resource Hub. And I am so happy to introduce our presenters today. Dr. Chaz Gipson is a national grants leader and scholar practitioner who has overseen large-scale discretionary grant programs serving hundreds of colleges and universities. His leadership spans federal grant monitoring, peer review oversight, technical assistance, and data-informed performance improvement. Dr. Gipson holds a PhD in communication, along with a master's in education leadership and policy studies from Howard. He also earned a Master of Divinity in Counseling from Virginia Union University, a BA in Sociology and Public Health Sciences from Morehouse, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at American University's School of Education. He's an active contributor to national research and leadership communities, including American Education Research Association and the ETS Advanced Qualitative Research Institute. He has engaged executive leadership development through the Higher Education Leadership Foundation and the National HBCU Executive Leadership Institute. Dr. Carrie Hall holds PhDs in biology and STEM education and has more than 15 years of experience in writing, directing, and mentoring grant efforts at the national level. Her passion is helping early career faculty define and grow their research agenda and realize their talents as researchers, teachers, mentors, and lifelong learners, the full definition of a scholar. Her QEM territories are Oklahoma and Arkansas, which she serves as a Heroes Fellow. And as a proud Tulsan, she's excited to be working in her home communities. Dr. Jehnae Linkins is a mechanical engineer, researcher, and founder of the nonprofit Don't Adjust Your Crown, where she advances equity in STEM through mentorship, design, and community engagement. She recently earned her PhD in mechanical engineering from the University of Maryland, where her research focused on equity-centered and Black-centered design in emerging technologies. Dr. Linkins works at the intersection of engineering, social impact, and inclusive research, helping institutions reimagine how STEM can better serve historically marginalized communities. So, without further ado, I am going to turn the floor over to our wonderful presenters, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Christine. Appreciate the introduction. And hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar for this afternoon. We're thrilled to be with you this afternoon to talk about strategies for taking your research idea to funded impact and then focusing your agenda and assessing its fundability. My colleagues and I are going to walk you through a little bit of an introduction to start and then get into some details about strategies that we as program officers in the federal space have found to work for our PIs. So I want to first start us off with a couple of stories. So before my time at the National Science Foundation, I ran a research lab at an R1 institution. And every semester, I interviewed undergraduate research assistants to work in my lab with my graduate students and postdocs. And one fall semester, one very enthusiastic, very energetic young woman came into my office for her interview. And after learning a bit about what my lab focused on at the time, I asked her a little bit about what she wanted to study. And her response was, I want to evolve whales, which I thought was a very ambitious, broad topic. for research for an undergraduate. And so we started talking a bit more about feasibility and how research is done in the laboratory. And so by the end of the time that we had our interview, I had been able to help her understand that evolving whales, especially in a lab setting, probably wasn't feasible. But we were able to narrow her research question down to something else that she was interested in, which was animal communication, which was the topic of my lab. So we put her on a project where she was studying the vibrational and communication between some insect species, and she was able to work with two graduate students and a postdoc, and came away as an undergraduate author on a publication. So it was all about focusing that research agenda and focusing her question. A second anecdote I want to tell you about is when I was a master's student, the department that I was in at the time was interviewing for a new faculty position, and one of the presenters that came to campus presented the idea that she wanted to find new sources of antimicrobial activity, antimicrobial peptides, antimicrobial organisms, etc. And it was a good talk, but for some reason I wasn't quite clicking with the idea. And so at one point I remember looking over at my department chair, and he had a very perplexed look on his face. And so after the talk, I followed him out into the hallway, and we got into a good conversation about the topic of the research. But that's the first time I remember a mentor of mine saying to me, "But that isn't a research question. That's an agenda." Her research question wasn't clear, and her methods weren't clear, and her source of funding wasn't clear. She just wasn't able to narrow it down to a fundable, tractable research question. So from those examples, we hope that you'll come away with the idea that your broad research agenda has to be scalable into a research question. So we're going to talk a little bit about strategies for doing that. So as program officers, believe it or not, we have had this happen frequently. I came from the National Science Foundation. My colleagues, Dr. Linkins, came from the Department of Defense, and Dr. Gipson came from the Department of Education. And we have all seen this in the proposals we've received. These broad, vague ideas that don't necessarily equal answerable research questions. So keep in mind that as program officers and directors of federal funding, what we need to see in your proposals is clear communication of your research question. We need your proposal and your research question to establish your authority in the field, and to display to us that you have an understanding of the gaps in the field of research that you're applying for funding for. So let's talk about a couple strategies. So strategies for refining your research question from that big idea down to something that is a fundable research question. So there's several strategies we like to see for refining that question. One of the biggest ones is using the 5 W's. The who, what, where, when, and why. Break that topic down and narrow that by population, by location, by specific question, by time period, by age group. And Dr. Linkins is going to talk more about this in her section of the presentation. You also need to identify the gap. Sure, you can say you want to evolve whales, but what about them? Where is the gap in the research about the evolution of whale communication? So narrow that gap so that you can define that research question more clearly. Adopt a lens or an aspect. Focus on a specific angle, such as the economic, the social, the political, rather than the entire issue. And then also consider using an appropriate framework, especially if you're in social science research or you're blending modalities and research methodologies. Frameworks for things like clinical or qualitative research will help you to structure your research question in a way that makes it a fundable research question. And then a big one that we're all going to talk about is consider feasibility. Feasibility ensures that the project can be completed with the available resources and within the time constraints of the grant period. So, to propose a research question such as I want to cure cancer or solve global climate change, that's great. But are you realistically going to do that in a 5-year, $1 million proposal? Probably not. So consider the feasibility of the time and the resources of the grant proposal. Now, there's one way to refine your research question that I found quite useful for PIs when I was working with them. It's called the FINER criteria. And that is an acronym that stands for feasibility, interest, novel, ethical, and relevant. So is it feasible? Like I said, can this be done in the time frame and with the resources available? Is it interesting? Does it engage you and the field? And novel, does it provide new insight or confirm or extend previous findings? Is it ethical? Will it be approved by the review boards? And is it relevant? Is it relevant to the funding agency and to the scientific community? And more on that in just a minute. So now that you've refined that question, let's talk about the entire proposal. So the entire proposal takes that big fancy idea and narrows it down to specific in-context tractable questions. So you're going to focus on the impact, clearly articulate what will be learned and what is not currently known and why it's worth knowing. You want to make sure you align it with the funder, ensure it directly addresses the specific goals of the request for proposals of the solicitation, and then consider creating sub-questions. If the topic is still too broad, break it into 3 or 4 specific sub-questions that are manageable. And oftentimes, when I would talk to PIs before they submitted a proposal, we would discover that one of their sub-questions was actually a fundable unit on its own. So you can go for a smaller grant with a smaller question that they then can build preliminary data for an even bigger project that links into your research agenda later on in a larger proposal. So consider that. Consider chunking your questions in a way that builds your research agenda, builds your research fundability portfolio for years and years to come, project after project. And then don't forget to seek feedback. We had a seminar earlier in the month that talked about getting to know your program officers and contacting them. That webinar is recorded on our hub, so you can absolutely go back and watch that webinar to understand how to contact a program officer to get feedback on your research questions. And then also don't forget to talk to your mentors and colleagues to ensure that your research questions are clear, compelling, and relevant to your field. And next, it looks like I will hand this off to Dr. Linkins to talk more about the good ideas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hall, for the introduction. I really appreciate it. So going next, we're going to talk about the problem with good ideas. And so the main thing here is that good ideas don't get funded, focused ideas do. So most proposals don't fail because they're bad ideas. They just fail because they're unfocused. So a good idea is often very broad, very exciting, and very intellectually interesting. But funders are not invested in ideas, and so they're more so invested in structured arguments. So they want to see the clarity of the problem, they want to see the clarity of the approach, and they want to see the clarity of the impact to which population you would be serving. So if you cannot explain your project in like 2 to 3 precise sentences, including who it affects, what changes, then you're not yet ready for that proposal stage. You're still at that idea stage. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So next we have our first step to which is clarifying the problem. So most early proposals start with a topic, and so you could, whether that be I study health disparities, I study AI ethics, I study education access. So that is not necessarily a problem statement. That is a field to which you are serving. So reviewers need to know like what specifically is broken in that field or in that area of interest for whom you're going to be serving. And why it has not been solved yet. So that's where we get that gap from. And then a strong proposal will clearly articulate those 4 things, which is the problem statement, the population, the gap, and the consequence, which is, what happens if that problem is not addressed. And so if you cannot clearly articulate the gap and then that consequence, and you don't have that proposal step yet, you just have that interest of trying to figure out where you're going. You can go to the next slide, please. So now moving from topic to researchable question. So again, I talked about topics being very broad, conceptual, descriptive. And so many proposals fail at this exact transition stage from topic to researchable question. So a topic signals interest, a research question signals readiness. A topic will describe a space, and a research question defines an investigation to which you will be solving. Funders are evaluating whether your question is answerable within that scope, budget, and timeline of that mechanism. So a strong research question will define the 4 things: the population, intervention, or phenomena, the context, the outcome. And so that would be that structure that the reviewers are looking for. And so they look out for that structure. So for examples of some topics, we have equity in STEM, mental health access, AI bias, climate resilience. And then for research questions, making sure we're hitting those specific, measurable, context-bound, outcome-bound, and driven ideas. Where an example would be for a question would be, how does integrating culturally responsive design into first-year engineering curricula affect retention of Black women in R1 institutions? And so if we go to the next slide, I'll put that into a little framework. So here we have The example, so again, the research question I had was, how does integrating culturally responsive design to first year engineering curricula affect retention of Black women at R1 institutions? And so here we go. First, among what population? So that would be the Black women in first year engineering programs at R1 institutions, whatever that specific problem is. So low retention rates and early stage engineering pathways. What is that gap? We have limited evidence on whether culturally responsive curriculum design improves early retention, and that's what we're going to look to see if we could prove that. And so what will this lead to? It will lead to improved persistence and retention in engineering degree programs. So you could use this format, this framework, to figure out if your topic can move to a research question that can be structured in this format. Let me go to the next slide, please. So step 3, defining the contribution. So once your research question is defined, the next step is positioning that. So reviewers are not only asking whether your question is clear, but they're asking whether it advances something meaningful. So strong proposals will explicitly state that gap, not vaguely, not implied, but very clearly. They'll clearly define the innovation. So what is different about your approach in comparison to others? You'll describe your outcome. So what will we know, build, or change in this scenario or this question or this investigation? And finally, they're going to articulate that impact. So why does this matter beyond your immediate field? So if reviewers have to infer what your contribution is, then you've made their job like 10 times harder. And so that will probably not really get rewarded. You can go to the next slide, please. So thinking about feasibility early. So this is where like our strong ideas often collapse. So reviewers are constantly asking, like, can this actually be done? So not in theory, not in like ideally, but in reality, like within this timeline, within this budget, within this team that you have, can this actually be done? So do you have access to that population? Do you have preliminary grounding matters? Do you have expertise of alignment in this field? And so one of the most common mistakes I see is like the scope inflation. So just people are trying to solve like this entire systemic issue within a 2 or 3 year war when we know that's not like feasible. It's not possible. Yeah, it could be possible, but realistically, it's not possible. And so just making sure you're narrowing down what that issue is. So feasibility will signal that maturity. It tells reviewers that you understand that not just the problem, but the constraints of the implementation, and that positions you as pragmatic and experienced. And so reviewers will fund projects that feel executable and not necessarily like aspirational. And you can go to the next slide, please. So in the last step is just aligning with that funding mechanism. So at this stage, you have your clear problem, you have your defined research question, you have your contribution, and you have a feasibility plan. So if your proposal doesn't clearly map onto the mission and review the criteria of whatever funding source that is, it will also struggle. So make sure you're reviewing. The review panels are not necessarily evaluating your idea in isolation, but they're evaluating against whatever that specific call to action was, specific priorities that they're looking to do, and lastly, like their specific scoring criteria. So making sure you're reading the solicitation language carefully, making sure you're looking at previously funded abstracts and seeing how they, formatted theirs, looking at their language and seeing if we can do the same thing with whatever your project is or your research question. So understanding that the funding rate and expectations at this level. So the strongest proposals don't just align generally, but they mirror those priorities of the call to action or whatever that structure is from that funding mechanism. Your proposal should make it easy for reviewers to justify funding you and not having to question if we should, but it'd be why we should. And you can go to the next slide, please. And so it's just these are some common mistakes, especially among like really strong scholars who care really deeply about their work. So the first thing is like writing too early. If your research question is not really fully defined, you're kind of building on unstable ground. You have a lot of different ideas and a lot of things that you want to put together. So another is solving for too much. So again, being too broad. Reviewers are looking for in-depth and rigor within a scope, but not sweeping transformation claims. One of the major things is like assuming the contribution is obvious. It may be obvious to you because this is your field or this is your passion, but it's not obvious to the reviewer reading like a 12-page proposal or 12 proposals in one sitting. And so making sure you're making sure that everything is clearly stated. And then most importantly, I think is probably ignoring the review criteria. So if the review criteria says intellectual merit and broader impact. Your proposal must clearly signal both and not just imply them. So making sure you're answering the questions that are being asked um, uh, right out. And then strong proposals reduce cognitive load for reviewers. So weak proposals increase it. So I did some cognitive research studies in my master's program. So I like to always talk about that cognitive load aspect of people reading like 24-page proposals. So just making sure it's clear and concise and to the point. And you can go to the next slide, please. And then lastly, this is just the roadmap for idea to fundable proposal. So again, we have our inspiration, clarifying the core problem, defining our research question, articulate your contribution, test your feasibility out, and then align with the funding mechanism. And then there you have your proposal development. And then with that, you can go to the you can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry, it is what's next. So what's next is we will have Dr. Chaz Gipson come up, and he will be talking about how we're going to be narrowing and sharpening the scope of our research question. There you go.
Thank you, Dr. Linkins. I appreciate that so much. Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. Well, let me begin as we're talking about assessing your proposal's fundability. Let me begin with something that may feel uncomfortable, but is critically important. All right. I know everybody have great ideas, but not all good ideas and great ideas are fundable ideas. In fact, some of the most intellectually interesting projects that I've seen were not competitive for funding. And fundable does not simply means innovative. It doesn't simply means it's theoretical or theoretically sophisticated. And it does not even mean that it's publishable. But what fundable really means is strategically aligned with the funder's priorities and structured in a way that allows a reviewer to confidently recommend it for investment without hesitation. When reviewers assess fundability, what they're looking for are 5 dimensions simultaneously. And that's the first one is alignment, as we see. And that simply is this clearly responsive to the stated priority. Okay, is this clearly responsive to the stated priority? Alignment. The second one is significance, which says, does this address a meaningful and documented gap? The third one is feasibility, which says, can this team realistically execute this within scope and timeline? The fourth one is return on investment, which says, what measurable difference will this make? And last but certainly not least is strategic fit, which says, does this advance the broader mission of the agency or the foundation? And fundability, please know, fundability is about clarity and confidence. If reviewers feel uncertain in any of these areas that you see on the screen or that I just highlighted, your scores begin to slide. So your job is to eliminate uncertainty at best. Next slide, please. Next, I'll talk about the alignment test. The most common reason strong proposals do not get funded is usually misalignment. A lot of times, yes, they are excellent, but they are not responsive, as I highlighted before. Reviewers are not scoring for creativity alone, but what reviewers are scoring for is responsiveness to a specific funding priority. So here's the alignment test. These are things that you should ask yourself or figure out, have you mirrored the language of the RFP, not copied it, but reflected it? Does your problem statement frame the issue the way the funder frames it? The next thing you should think, are you solving their problems? Are you solving their articulated priority? Or are you or your preferred research question that you're trying to answer? See, there is a difference from being in the neighborhood of the priority and directly answering it, okay? So reviewers are often instructed to score based on responsiveness. So if the alignment is unclear, they hesitate, and hesitation lowers scores. Funders operate within various constraints, and that may include congressional mandates, board strategies, agency frameworks. So when your proposal clearly advances those structures, then you make it easier for reviewers to justify investment. Okay. Also, one more thing before we move. Alignment is not about compromising your agenda, but it's about positioning your agenda strategically. Next slide, please. Next, I want to highlight the feasibility and capacity scan. Once alignment is clear, reviewers move quickly to feasibility. This is where many promising proposals lose competitiveness. One of the largest red flags that I've seen for many years is the scope of inflation, especially among early career scholars. You see many things in their proposals like multiple sites, or you may see multiple research questions, or even multiple methodologies, or even very ambitious timelines. Now, ambitious is not the problem, but diffusion is. Reviewers are asking while they're reviewing your proposals, can this actually be completed within this project period? Or does this budget reflect the proposed work? Or does this feel mismatched? Or has this team demonstrated expertise in the methods proposed? Or even is there evidence of institutional support? Fundability increases when the scope is disciplined, when the methods are precise, when the timeline is realistic, and when the budget tells the same story as the narrative. A proposal that feels executable often outperforms ones that feels aspirational. So remember, funders are investing in successful completion, not compelling ideas. Next slide, please. Next, we'll look at the fundability checklist. So before submission, I strongly encourage scholars to conduct what I call the fundability audit. This is where you step out of the role as the principal investigator of this project and you step into the role of the reviewer. And then these are things you ask yourself. If I were reviewing 20 to 30 proposals, would this one clearly stand out for the right reasons? You ask yourself, is the impact specific and measurable, or is it abstract and seems very aspirational? Ask yourself, is the value proposition obvious within the first 5 minutes or less of reading? Ask yourself, does this proposal reflect the current funding climate, including clarity of language, strategic framing, and awareness of priorities? And perhaps most importantly, ask yourself, would I confidently recommend this for funding at the requested amount? Not maybe, not with revisions, but confidently, because fundability is not accidental. It is the result of strategic positioning, disciplined scope, and very, very, very intentional alignment. And you please remember this: strong research advances knowledge. Strategically positioned research advances systems and secure funding to sustain impact. So I'll pause here, and I hope what we have offered today will help you move from a compelling idea to a strategically positioned, funded proposal. And we're happy to take your questions from here.
Please feel free to use the Q&A box to type your questions, or if you'd like, you may raise your hand and we can spotlight you.
Well, I have a question, so I'm going to ask the question of the panelists. And that question is, in general, what is besides not having your focus scope, what is the next thing that hurts proposers in terms of are their narratives typically weak? Is it a budget issue? What components of the proposal tend to be the ones that cause the most problems or most concern in your experience?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tarina. I think at the National Science Foundation, I was in the EDU directorate, and I think one of the things I saw most, besides feasibility, was that oftentimes the proposal was not written in a way that clearly communicated to us how they were going to answer the question that they posed. So whether the methodology might be off or it wasn't outlined clearly enough. We don't need a protocol. We don't need to go into that level of detail in your methodology, but we do need to know the frameworks that you're using, the data analysis, the interview methodology, those types of things. A lack of detail makes a program officer and reviewers question whether you know what you're doing, to be frank, in that research question. So you have to give us enough in your methodology so that we can assess whether it's appropriate and can answer the question you've posed.
Thank you, Dr. Hall, and thank you, Tarina, for that question. Let me add to that. Another thing that we often see is the problem statement and significance, because that need statement and problem statement, that's usually at the top of the proposal. And so common things that we see is the problem too broad or too vague, or is it not really supported by data? It's always important to make sure that you're using data to support your problem, to show what are the issues, what are the challenges that you're facing that we see. The proposal also usually sometimes we see that it does not clearly explain why the problem matters now. And then the connection to the funder's priority sometimes is weak. And so reviewers are usually or always looking for clearly defined problems so that they know exactly why they're funding or recommending something for funding, evidence and literature that supports that need, and usually a compelling case of why funding this project matters, along with the things such as the research questions. Sometimes it may be too many and too broad, etc., in the methodology that Dr. Hall has already mentioned. I'll also add one more thing, is that sometimes budget justification, the budget is really, really, sometimes it kills people's proposals, because sometimes the budgets does not match the project activities. And sometimes costs appears inflated. Sometimes justification is not clear. Sometimes it's missing key resources needed to really complete the work. And so it's hard to really make a decision or make a recommendation when those things are not fully in alignment.
And we have a question, and thank you so
And
much,
what I
Dr.
say, we'll say for the DoD.
Oh, sorry, Jehnae. Dr. Linkins, please go ahead.
Oh yeah, thank you. I said what I was on the research proposals. The issue is that the investigators focus heavily on that technical aspect or that idea, but they fail to clearly connect it with the mission, like defense capability, the defense.
Are we having a connection issue?
Yeah, you didn't hear her response?
Not really.
Okay. Are you able to repeat it, Dr. Linkins? You did wobble a little bit in terms of the modulation of the voice. Oh, she must be frozen.
Okay, I'll move on to another question. Is there a good way to assess what counts as a good research question? I know Dr. Lincoln shared that problem statement. Is that the way a research question should be asked?
I'll jump in here while we're trying to get Dr. Lincoln's back. I would say that that is a good way to phrase your question, but it depends on your field, it depends on your methodology, and it depends on the call for proposals that you're addressing. The question, that's a great general way to ask a question because it hits those 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, why. Sometimes you can take those questions and chunk them out into it, like I said, into individual, more fine scale questions as well. But overall, what we look for is in that well-defined research question is that you're addressing all of those components. So I would say the question that Dr. Linkins presented was a great way to frame a question. It gives me all the information I need as a program officer to be able to say, okay, I know exactly what they're asking and who they're going to address and why and where and how. So I would say that was a great way to present that question format.
Yeah, great question. And I'll also add a strong research question must be very clear and specific. And so while reviewers are reviewing, they should immediately understand what is being studied, who or what the study focuses on, what relationship or issues is being examined, and so forth. And so as a former research professor as well, I will always tell my students that a good research question should directly emerge from the problem statement and the literature review. So as reviewers, they want to know, does this question logically flow from the problem that's being presented? Does this address a real gap in the literature or practice, and so forth? So we certainly want to ensure and that it's researchable. The research question must be answerable using empirical methods and so forth, whether that's qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods, and so forth. And we mentioned those things, but also in the lines of research is feasibility. You've heard us talk about feasibility throughout this presentation, and a good research question must be manageable within the scope of the project. That timeline is important. Resources, access to participants and data, project scope, and even the significance. It really matters intellectually, socially, and practically.
I have a related question. We are living in changing times where some of federal agencies have realigned their priorities. We talk here in this webinar about prioritization and alignment with either the RFP's priorities, but I'm thinking of agency priorities more broadly. How responsive do you want to be to the changing discourses that the agencies are putting out? So, for instance, at NSF, there's been some recommendations about how to talk about broadening participation or about equity-focused research. What would you recommend for kind of monitoring oneself without losing the integrity of the work you're trying to propose?
Mm.
I'll jump in just real quick. One thing that I have been telling PIs, potential PIs, is that if you are doing equity focused work, that is still allowed. You might just have to check your language. The language that we're using now, and from what I've seen across the federal agencies, because broadening participation is in statute, it means that we are still trying to bring people into the STEM fields. We're still trying to bring people into higher education and retain them. We're still trying to do that. It's just we need to make sure those opportunities are open for everybody. And so that's the language you need. You want to make sure that any progress, and I'm thinking specifically now of programming grants more so than primary research grants. But if you're proposing a program for students to participate in, for example, you want to make sure that program is open for everybody, even if there is a target audience. You still can't restrict its participation to a particular group. That would be against what the agencies are allowed to do now at this point. So just check your language, get to know your program officer because they can give you the most up-to-date minute-to-minute updates on language use and things like that. So get to know your program officer. And then also for us, for your QEM fellows that are in your territories, as you make connections to us, we can also help you navigate that kind of question.
That's thank you, Dr. Hall. Let me add to that with the language, and I'm going to expand on that. Federal agencies they signal their priorities through strategic plans, through RFP language, through congressional mandates, and through agency leadership priorities. So strong proposals must make sure that you are studying those things. I always tell people the RFP is like your Bible. You see exactly what's there. It's telling you what they want, what they're looking for. It's telling you how you're going to be scored when you look at those things. And so just study it and kind of guide that way. I was having the same conversation recently, and pretty much the same thing as Dr. Hall stated. You can still do the work, but you're going to have to really shift your language. And there are a list of words out there that we should not use when doing proposals. When you're talking about certain words, there's certain words out there. And unfortunately, in this time, we must, if we want to be funded, we must follow what's out there. And so again, follow the strategic plans, follow the RFP, request for proposals, the congressional mandates, and the agency leadership priorities. They are published.
So I want to add a couple of comments to what our presenters have said. As as of having attended this webinar or any previous webinar, you now have access to the QEM Resource Hub. Within the QM Resource Hub, there is a resource that speaks to language. It speaks to those words that are banded and what the alternatives to them are. So you can go and use that resource to determine which words you need to replace. And then just as a general knowledge tool, if you look at a word that you know needs to be replaced or you have heard that needs to be replaced, you can simply do a synonym search on those words and use those alternative words as well. But I will say that there are some quite creative ones in our resource hub. So I would encourage you to check those out. And if this is your first webinar with us, you will get access by this Friday. So just wanted to say that.
Thank you all. And we have several questions that have popped up in the Q&A. And the first is, do you have any advice around basing a research agenda on a specific methodology versus a specific topic? So methodologically focused proposals.
Could you repeat that one more time, Christine, please?
Sure. Do you have any advice around basing a research agenda on a specific methodology versus a specific topic?
I guess a follow-up question I would have is, are you looking to enhance the methodology, add something different, change it? Like, what are you looking to do? Or are you looking to use that methodology for something? I guess that would be maybe a clarification question for me.
They said. Use the methodology.
So typically what I've recommended to grad students, postdocs, PIs is that typically your research question determines the methodology you use. So that using it in the reverse, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I'm not sure how to recommend that. So if there's a research methodology that you've read about or that you saw in a paper that you thought sounded interesting, I would say that's great, but just make sure it does answer the question you're asking. So there's kind of a back and forth there, a give and take, an and instead of a but yeah, so I think approaching it in that way might be helpful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would further say that using a specific methodology is a tool versus, they're two different things. They're apples and oranges. You have a topic and then you have a methodology to prove something or show something within your topic. So I don't know that they're necessarily interchangeable, and you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, panelists.
One of the things I usually would tell students that are working on their research and dissertations and things, that most scholars, it's generally stronger to build research agenda around a problem or topic rather than a single methodology. So a topic center agenda, it really allows you to ask the important questions about the phenomenon that you care about. So, for example, if someone is interested in, let's see, college access and student success, I don't know, they may use qualitative interviews to understand student experiences, but survey data to analyze patterns across the institutions, or even mixed methods to connect outcomes to lived experiences. But either way, uh, it's really important to kind of build around the problem versus the topic, and then also really what you want to do and what you're trying to find out.
Hey, Yulia has a question, comment. The overall proposal's budget also depends on the institution. For example, the overhead, indirect costs. The difference can be drastic, 20% versus 60% IDC for the proposals with a similar scope. Given that the program's funds are limited, does this difference play a role in funding? If the program can fund two proposals instead of one due to a high overhead of the latter, does that play a role in the decision?
The programs for which I worked in NSF, it did not. If that would, in my opinion, I was also an ethics official for NSF, and in my opinion, I wouldn't say that if we opted for one proposal over another based on strictly on their overhead rate, I would consider that an unethical decision. It stands on the merit of the research itself. And so the intellectual merit and the broader impacts are, and how it aligns with the RFP is what we would score a proposal based upon. Now, budgets do have to align. I will say that. However, that wouldn't be a driving decision at NSF. It wouldn't have been in the past. I will say too, as far as budget, and this came up earlier, I wanted to mention, one of the budget alignment problems that really kind of was a problem that I saw was not giving the PI, co-PIs, senior personnel appropriate compensation for the work that they were doing, only to avoid overhead. We are in a time of inequity and injustice, and I don't believe in uncompensated work. And so in order to fit a budget into a particular budget line by stripping away your own compensation for the work and effort you're going to be putting in just because of overhead costs, I don't agree with that. And I did send proposals back as declined because they weren't adequately compensating themselves for the work that we're going to be doing. I want you all to get paid for the work you're doing. This is your intellectual merit. This is your livelihood. This is your career. And you should be compensated appropriately for that. If you have research as part of your tripartite faculty position or whatever it might be, you need to be compensating yourself. Yes, that 60% hits hard, but maybe there's somewhere else you can cut a budget, right? So just make sure you're compensating yourself. And the overhead costs, the indirect costs, it'll roll through.
Thank you, Dr. Hall. I totally agree with you 100%. There have been several times I've had to do site visits and make some adjustments because people were not being compensated fairly based on what they should be, by the work, by the region, by the state's pay, and things like that. So thank you for that. And she is totally right. So the answer is no.
So another question, and we may not be able to answer this, but which topics are the most fundable right now from NSF and NIH? Any idea?
What I'm hearing is that it has to be aligned with the national priorities. So AI, nuclear, and whatever the other, there's 6 total federal priorities, and we have them in our resource hub listed out. And you can find them by doing a Google search as well on national priorities for research. It has to align. Even if it is an education proposal, you have to align it with one of those core priorities in saying that you're training the workforce to address problems in AI or whatever it might be, because those national priorities are being really pushed at the agencies right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to also add to mental health and behavior health to that as well.
Okay. From Craig, given this session's information, how do you best frame a research question for other types of proposals, such as workforce development proposals? It seems for those proposals, they have a lot more of a goal of using existing education practices instead of creating a new education method.
I'll kindly push back on that a little bit. Actually, coming from the education directorate, I would say we want to see novel things because what we've been doing in the past hasn't been working. So if our goal is to broaden participation in STEM, regardless of what group you might be focused on, in general, broaden participation in America, in the United States, then that is absolutely something that is a priority. And I think that changing the systems, changing the methodologies of education is something we do want to see. Now, I've seen proposals where they, where it's let's completely disassemble the entire university system in the US and rebuild. Now, think about feasibility, first of all, but how do you change the systems that you're in, your educational systems that you're in, so that they can be built towards that future, towards those national funding priorities? I think that's a hot topic right now. So yeah, I would encourage a proposal in that space.
Thank you. Other questions? Would anyone like to come off mute and raise their hand or use the Q&A box? Okay. Okay, Craig, you are coming off mute.
Yeah, thank you for that information. Just to clarify, I wasn't, I guess, saying there wasn't novelty, and I say this because I'm working on a proposal for like USDA at the moment, and that's workforce development related. And we know, for example, we know what the teachers need. We know what new things are needed to be incorporated into the classroom that would support those teachers. But at the same time, it's not like we're going to try, and maybe this is where I'm looking at this wrong and I need realigned. But to me, that doesn't seem like it's the proposal that's trying to do this workforce development like this isn't trying to change, okay, we're going to test this new research system. What we want to do is integrate new things into the classroom. So how do you frame the quote research question in that capacity when I guess that's what I meant by using existing type systems. We know that US Ag teachers are good at what they do. They just lack certain things. But to me, that as a researcher, that doesn't seem. I'm not a social science researcher, so this is where I'm coming from. But as a plant science researcher, that doesn't look like something to me that's a research question. It's like we need this. How do you frame that research question, I guess, is what I was trying to get at.
So when you say we don't need this, as an example, are you talking about materials? Are you talking about curriculum? Are you talking about
both? So we're talking about they need physical research, they need curriculum, and they need new research materials or the resources that they could implement in the classroom. That would be what this proposal would be directed at providing.
Gotcha.
But to me, that's not I don't know how you frame a research question out of that, because our goal is to provide these teachers those resources so they can do their job and teach the workforce as it needs to be.
Well, I think that's where the research question becomes, is this thing we're providing an efficacious way to change how the students are learning?
Okay.
So if you partner with an education researcher, they would be able to frame that question. Given the materials or the curriculum that you're supplying, they could ask questions about efficacy. They could ask questions about student motivation. They could ask questions about teacher knowledge in the STEM field that you're addressing. There's all kinds of actually exciting questions that could go into that.
Okay. Thank you.
So yeah, I definitely, and I'll just say too, if that proposal goes in and there's not an education specialist on it, that's a red flag that won't get it funded.
Well, and we do have two of those. We're working as a team, and I've just not run the draft narrative by them yet. We still have some time on this, but we
Get
do
them
have
involved
two that we're
early.
bringing on as
Yeah.
consultants that we work with in terms of others, and this is kind of an expansion of other work that we're.
I would say get them involved early so that they can help you frame it in the proper way.
Okay, thank you.
And I would go back to what the panelists said earlier in response to your question is look at your data. What does the data say about having these materials or not, or changing this curriculum or not? If you don't change it, what does it look like for the future of your target audience? If you do change it, what do you anticipate will be the effect of getting these materials or curriculum changes, whatever the case may be? So you still got to frame it in the context in which they gave you, in terms of writing the research question: who, what, where, why, when. But I think that your concern is about, well, if all I want to do is buy materials, how is that novel? Well, the way you make it novel or make it innovative is you show that those things that you want to purchase will cause this. So there's a cause and effect from the purchase of the item or the development of the item to what significantly or innovatively that will change.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, because we have survey data from the teachers saying what they need, and it is exceptionally clear cut of what they want, what they need. So in terms of framing it, we have that component. We have the justification. It aligns with the program, and we had all that part. I was just confused about the framing the research question per se. We have really clear objectives of what we want, really clear metrics of what we could measure, all those kinds of things. That was just that research question framing was interesting to me and what I was trying to figure out.
Thank you so much to all of our participants and especially to our panelists today. We're very happy to have you here. And I popped into the chat a link where you can go and evaluate this webinar. We hope to see you at future webinars, which you can find on QEM's website under events. So thank you so much for attending today. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you soon at a forthcoming webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you all.